Another aspect of interoperability from a high introductory level is thinking about the economic value of interoperability and the idea of standards. So I'm going to start to introduce those concepts which later speakers will develop more fully. And in particular, starting with the economics of digital innovation, which is part of what's creating the technological change that is really moving and putting, really pushing change into the electricity system. When we look out into the economy as a whole and we think about digital technologies and the effect they've had on our daily lives, from an economic perspective, one of the biggest impacts they've had is that they reduce transaction costs, which are the costs of parties coming to some agreement for mutual benefit. And by reducing transaction costs, you get more mutually beneficial exchange in this system that we're talking about. When you look at digital systems, when you think about, say, the internet or how you interact and engage with computers and computer networks in your own lives, and you kind of step back and apply the principles that we're talking about today, you can see the extent to which digital systems are modular. They're in pieces and components, and you can mix and match and plug and play. And I think the extent to which we rely on our USB interfaces and the devices that the interfaces enable are an example of this, of the modularity and interoperability that affects our daily lives and has enabled us to create so much value. One other thing that is important from an economics perspective is the extent to which digital technologies and that modularity and interoperability reduce the cost of interconnecting devices to each other. Right? That it's easier and cheaper and faster. You plug in your USB memory stick into your computer, and these days it just works. Right? In the early days, it wasn't always that way, but now it just works. And that's, I think, a way to think about the standards that we're considering here, is it just works. From an economics perspective, digital innovation and interoperability also make more decentralized systems feasible and more beneficial. Right? That it's actually valuable to lots of parties to do things in a more decentralized way and at smaller scale that used to be done in a more centralized way at larger scale. So on a general level, that's what we see when we look at digital innovation from an economic perspective around the economy. Now, what does this mean when we think about the idea of standards? And in her introductory comments about what's going on in Minnesota, Tricia referred to the IEEE 1547 distributed resource interconnection standards. And so one of the things that we'll develop throughout the day is the idea that interoperability is implemented through a consensus process where industry partners and other parties will come together, and they will go through a consensus process to create this set of key relationships among components in the system. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I've put, just as a visual, not to read in gory detail, the process by which the IEEE 1547 standard has evolved over the past 16 years, and has had a recent update to more fully incorporate distributed resources using digital technologies such as smart inverters. And so I think this is an example, and the USB memory stick is also an example of the use of standards as a consensus process to coordinate people. So from an economic perspective, we think of standards as providing a focal point. So they are an open, transparent, commonly available focal point concept that industry and other parties can use to coordinate around, okay, here's the relationship we're going to have between these components, and we'll all agree to that, and then we're going to go, design our networks, design our things, separately. And so what standards do in terms of reducing the costs of implementing digital systems is enable providers to gather and interpret a whole lot of data so that they can tailor product and service offerings for all kinds of benefits: environmental benefit, economic benefit, reliability, resilience. The idea with standards is to really focus on ideas that are commonly agreed upon and what we'll call open standards. And I'm not going to go into any depth defining that right now because I think we'll talk about that extensively throughout the afternoon. But the idea is that having these commonly agreed upon open standards reduce costs of implementing these complex digital systems. So where do regulators come into this story? And why is it important to think about from a policy perspective? I think there are several reasons. One is that a lot of the regulatory issues that will probably come across your docket, especially these days, will involve grid modernization or DER interconnection of some sort. Interoperability is an important component of increasing the long-term value of those grid modernization investments. And I should also say that I'm going to make these I'm going to assert these as claims for now. And throughout the rest of the afternoon, I think we are going to work together to make the case for why these claims are true. Another important concern for regulators is that if you compare an interoperable system with a closed system, with and without, much the same way as Chris alluded to at the beginning, that a closed system might in the short run look like it's least cost. But if you look over the longer term, over the life of the technology system, that the interoperability may enable more interconnection, more creation of value around the distribution edge, and create other value streams that mean higher net value and lower cost in the long run. And I think you could probably tell by the number of times I've mentioned it that interoperability is essential for DER interconnection. And so if you're considering any DER interconnection values, interoperability is a crucial step in making that happen, in the feasibility as well as the cost effectiveness of doing so. And then finally, grid modernization means that the investments that utilities are going to be making are going to look really different from the investments that they were making 10, 20, 30 years ago. Investments are now going to increasingly be in communications assets. And that means investing in digital technologies that are probably shorter lived and that you may not be as familiar with as the traditional types of investments that would get proposed by your utilities. And so what that means is that we're in a process where we should start thinking about frameworks to assess the prudence of those investments and what ways to evaluate those proposals when they come before you. And I think I will stop there and we will flesh out those details over the course of the afternoon.